Thank you. It is an honor to introduce the first speaker of this symposium. It's the first time that we have a senator that is not an Alaskan senator speaking to us, but certainly is a person that loves Alaska, loves the Arctic, and we really welcome him. Senator Angus was sworn as Maine's first independent United States senator, a strong believer in the need for greater bipartisan dialogue and relationship building. He's a member of quite a number of committees. I'm not going to list them, but you can look at additional information in the program. In fact, the way this symposium is set up, most of the presentations are very short, so we can save time. In case you want me to continue talking, but one thing that I really want to say about the senator, just recently we learned that he's an avid photographer, and that in fact his staff allow him now to not only post on Instagram, but actually caption his picture. So I do hope that when he leaves today, he'll be able to take some snapshots and caption them for us. Senator, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I don't know why Pablo was looking at me when he said be short. I am a senator, after all. It's sort of intimidating, and this happens quite often to me, that you end up speaking to a group where every single member of the audience knows more about the subject than you do. And there's a wonderful story along those lines where there was a famous physics professor who was going around the country doing a very arcane lecture about string theory and physics, and he gave it about 10 times. He had the same driver with him everywhere he went, and after about the 10th time, the driver said, "You know, Prof, I can do that lecture as well or better than you." The professor said, "Nonsense, you can't possibly do that. This is very complicated stuff." The driver said, "So let's try. The next stop, we'll switch uniforms. I'll put on the tweed jacket, you put on the black jacket and the hat, and I'll do the lecture." So the professor says, "Okay, I will try it," and he stands up in the back of the room. The driver does a perfect job, delivers the lecture, all the formulas, everything on the board, everything is exactly right. But the professor says, "Yeah, but wait till he gets to the questions, you know." So the first question comes, and it's a very complex question, and the driver said, that question is so easy, my driver in the back of the room can answer it." So that's sort of the way I feel today. All of you know more about this subject. Why is a senator from Maine interested in the Arctic? Well, in part because of my committee assignments, but in part because of my geography. Committee assignments, I'm on 3 committees that's relevant to developments in the Arctic. One is Armed Services, the other is Intelligence, and the third is Energy and Natural Resources. So all of those committees in one way or another are concerned with Arctic issues. Geography is the location of Maine. All I need to tell you is the first commercial cruise ship to go through the Arctic Ocean last summer, the next stop, once they reached the east coast of the United States, was Maine. Bar Harbor, the Crystal Serenity. And I've been saying for years that Maine will be the first port in the United States that ships that go through the Arctic Ocean are going to have access to U.S. ports. And lo and behold, the very first commercial traveling ship, the Crystal Serenity, did in fact come to Bar Harbor. That was the first place it came after it got through the Arctic Ocean. I don't know why we all didn't go on that trip. An outside cabin was only $90,000. But in any case, geography is important to us. Maine has always been a seafaring state. I always like people to leave any time I talk with some nugget of information. I'll share with you 2. One is, you've heard the term down east Maine. You hear that term quite frequently. Where does that come from? Where it comes from is, if you actually look at a map of Maine, Maine sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean to the east. In fact, eastern Maine is 400 miles closer to Europe than New York City. So, and the prevailing winds, of course, are from the west, so the sailing people would be sailing downwind east to go along the Maine coast. That's the origin of the term down east. While I'm thinking about giving you little facts Admiral, good to see you. Another fact I'll leave with you is the origin of the word politics. Politics is an ancient word. It comes from the Greek word poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning small blood-sucking insects. And you put them together and you have politics. So now you have some knowledge you can take away from this presentation. In Maine, we also are vitally interested in climate change. The Gulf of Maine is warming at the highest rate of any body on Earth except the Arctic Ocean, for reasons we're not exactly clear on. We have a very long-standing Arctic and climate research lab at the University of Maine. I remember seeing Greenland ice cores there years ago, many years ago, before even thinking about issues of climate change. We also have the Bigelow Lab and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. So the development and changes in the Arctic affect us as they affect the waters of the east coast of the United States. And as I mentioned, we see it as an economic opportunity. What's going on? I can tell you that there is a heightened interest in the Arctic in the Congress. It's not universal, but it's significant. Lisa Murkowski and I, who I think will be with you a little bit later, the senior senator from Alaska, formed something called the Senate Arctic Caucus a couple of years ago. Some of you may have heard me say this. At one point, when I was just in the Senate, I stopped Lisa on the way onto the Senate floor and said, Senator Murkowski, I want to be the Arctic senator. And she said, you can be the assistant Arctic senator. She had already staked that out. Well, I got to tell you, Dan Sullivan from Alaska has also embraced this issue. And in fact, in the Armed Services Committee, John McCain refers to him as the senator from the Arctic because he raises the issue so frequently, both in terms of national security and recently, just 2 weeks ago, in the committee markup of the National Defense Bill, Dan Sullivan sponsored an amendment, I co-sponsored it, to propose the acquisition of 6 icebreakers by the United States. As you all know, we are woefully unprepared in terms of icebreakers. I've heard estimates of how many the Russians have, which range between 17 and 40. Fran's going to go on one later this week, a Russian icebreaker. We have 1.5. When I say a half, the other one is being essentially used for parts to maintain the one that steams between the Antarctic and the Arctic every year. I mean, it's not an adequate response, and so the Congress, Admiral, is working on this, and we really are. I'm seeing more interest both in the House and in the Senate, and how we can develop additional capacity. Icebreakers are the infrastructure of the Arctic. They're the highways, in effect, and the Russians have an interstate system, and we have a country road, if that, because of the importance. And it's doubly important for us, I think, because the route closer to Canada and North America is not as clear as the northern route along the Russian boundary, and so this is going to be very important for us. Now, I think it's important, and you all are scientists, you know this better than I, we can't get ahead of ourselves. I'm told by commercial shipping interests that we really still are a fair ways away from commercial utilization of the Northwest Passage or of the Arctic Ocean Passage. It's not next year or 5 years from now. It may be 10 or 20 years from now. But if current trends continue, clearly the passage over the pole is going to be one of the most important sea lanes on Earth. And of course, it's going to make the Bering Strait probably one of the most strategic spots on Earth. Let me conclude, I shouldn't say finally. My wife says I say finally too much, it gets people's hopes up. But we're rounding into the final turn. Many of you are scientists, as we just learned from this cool app. Although I read it wrong, it said guess how many, and I thought I was supposed to guess. So I didn't. I was predicting rather than being truthful about who I was. But many of you are scientists. We can't make good policy without good data. That is something that I've learned in all of my career in public policy and in politics and trying to make good laws. In fact, what I have found, and this is, I can't communicate this more emphatically, what I have found in my experience going back to being governor of Maine and now in the Senate, if you can develop a shared understanding of the facts, the policy prescription is pretty easy. It almost becomes self-evident if everybody understands the facts. If they don't understand the facts or if they have different views of the facts, then it's practically impossible to get to a policy prescription. The current debate we're having on health care is a perfect example. There are people who are convinced as a matter of fact that the Affordable Care Act is collapsing, it can't survive, and it's in a death spiral. They believe that's a set of facts that drives their desire to get rid of it and do something else. On the other hand, there are people who say, no, it's not collapsing, it's actually in reasonably good shape and with some changes could be quite successful. Again, that's a counterfactual observation, and that's why it's so hard for these groups to get together. If we could all understand exactly what's going on, how many people are covered, how many lose coverage, that kind of thing, we could indeed, I think, come to a reasonable policy prescription. So that's a long way of saying that what you're doing in terms of the science and understanding what's happening and demonstrating it to us in a way that we can understand and absorb is just, it could not be more important. Policy ultimately, believe it or not, follows from data and facts. It's not a straight line, and it often is interrupted by ideology and politics and those kinds of things. But ultimately, if we have good data, we can make good decisions. So the second piece of this is give us the data in ways that we can understand and use. I'm a visual learner. I commend to you the work of a guy named Edward Tufte, T-U-F-T-E. If you haven't, you don't have to Google him now, but Google him later. He's the world's expert on the visual presentation of numerical data. And it's really hard to absorb mentally a series of numbers or dates. That's why we're all not so good at history, remembering the date of the Battle of Cowpens. But we can absorb a picture, and if we can call up, am I doing it here, or how are we going to do this? I want to first show you the greatest visual presentation of numerical data in history. And it was created in the early 1800s by a French artist. And if it comes up, okay, well, I can see it. Well, I guess it isn't going to come up, unfortunately. Okay, there it is. This is a visual representation of Napoleon's attack on Moscow. And the thickness of the line represents how many troops he had. So the top thick line back here on the left is leaving Paris. The army marches across Europe through Austria, ends up at Moscow at the far end, and you can see how much it's diminished, and then starts back, and you can actually see river crossing. You can see how many people drowned in that river. And then you see the trickle of people that ended up coming back to Paris. That's the kind of presentation that we need from you to demonstrate what's going on in the Arctic. I love this graph and urge you, you can easily, if you Google Napoleons Retreat from Moscow, Tufte, or something like that, you'll find this, and it just tells you so much, and you can't miss it, rather than the numbers. Now, what do I do? Go to the next. Just here. Got it. Here's another one that I think is good, relevant to this question. This is a graph I ran across a couple of years ago about the volume of sea ice. And I'm throwing these up not to give you information you don't know, but to suggest this influenced me as a policymaker. And you can see it's the volume, 16,000 cubic meters, and then it goes down, or million, and it goes down to 5. I mean, that tells me something really serious is going on. I hope I'm not being condescending here, but I'm telling you how to communicate with me and my colleagues in order to get across what is important to you and to our citizens in understanding these issues. This slide made clear to me what was happening to the Arctic ice in a way that I had never seen before. And here's the one that showed me what was going on in sea level rise in a way that I had never thought of before. This is the last 24,000 years, and 24,000 years ago, the oceans were 390 feet shallower than they are today because all the water was locked up in the glaciers. And if you think about it, where we are today is the Antarctic and Greenland are the last remnants of the glaciers. And as the glaciers melted, the sea level went up. And there are a couple of things you learn about this. One is this point right here, the meltwater pulse 1A, that's 1 foot of sea level rise per decade. And that's what many scientists are predicting for the next 100 years. In other words, what's happening now happened before. And the other thing that this tells us that I think is important is that there's this long stable period, 8,000 years at the end, up at the top, that happens to be human history. And there's a phenomenon that we're all familiar with, even if we're not familiar with the term, called the recency effect. And the recency effect is all of us are prone to think that what happened yesterday will happen tomorrow. Well, if the ocean has been where it is now for 8,000 years, it's logical that we would all think that's a fixed, that's a given, the level of the ocean. Seeing this graph stunned me. I'd never thought about it this way before. The Gulf of Maine was essentially a lake 24,000 years ago because the Georges banks were above water level. It was a large, almost enclosed body of water. And then the final one, again, this is a visual presentation of numeric data. This is the Jakobshavn Glacier. I went up there last summer with the commandant, and we went out on the ice sheet and on the glacier. But the reason I find this a powerful image, it's a little hard to see, but each one of those lines is a year. This is like 1850, and it goes to the retreat of the glacier. But one of the bits of information that this conveys is it has retreated as much in the last 10 years as in the prior 110 years. And again, the point I'm making is give me stuff like this that can be used to demonstrate, and it's irrefutable in terms of the data and is very helpful. So when I was a kid, we had, I can't remember who was the guy that told people it was how to win friends and influence people. Carnegie, Dale Carnegie. Well, this is how to win friends and influence congressmen. I hope I haven't been too strong about this, but I'm suggesting that these are ways that you can convert your work into data and facts that will help us make good policy. And the final point really is we've got to get it right. this is of tremendous consequence. It's of tremendous results in terms of economics, of energy exploration, of national security, tremendously important area of the world, becoming more important all the time. It's as if we just discovered the Mediterranean Sea. And we've got to get this right, and you have to be the people who help us to understand the facts, to present the facts to our constituents, and form the basis of good public policy. Thanks. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator.
And I hate to be the guy who talks and then leaves, but I have to go to an Armed Services Committee meeting. And maybe we'll talk about icebreakers.
Just to let you know that we are under very strict regulations.
Yes.
So the audience is getting chapstick, and the speakers are getting these
Great.
eyeglasses cleaners. I wish we had aspirin, because I'm pretty sure the audience is getting a headache. I do apologize for the technical difficulties, and thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Great to be with you.